Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And I am here with another in-depth review of a very special comic. Now I try not to do these too often. I usually try to reserve these kinds of videos for comics that get me genuinely excited. But when I heard the news that Jean Grey was getting a 4-issue solo series, and one written by Louise Simonson no less, I just knew I was going to make a review of this comic. Also, full disclosure, I've actually met Louise Simonson in person. I've gotten her autograph. One of the comics she signed is on my wall right now as I am making this video. Both she and her husband, Walt Simonson, are an absolute delight. And Louise's love for comics, especially the X-Men, and especially Jean Grey, it's just uncanny if that's not too fitting a word. So, expect this review to be biased as hell. And that's on top of my own inherent love of all things X-Men and Jean Grey. I already made a 20-minute video about Phoenix Resurrection, the comic that brought Jean Grey back to life in the best possible way. I also made it a point to release that video before the first issue of this series came out. So yes, I am going to be an unapologetic fanboy throughout this review, and I make no apologies for that. So, that disclaimer aside, it's worth getting into the circumstances surrounding this series, because it actually marks a serious turning point for Jean Grey. The events spin directly out of what happened in 2023's Hellfire Gala, an event that, in my opinion, marked the darkest moment the X-Men have faced since House of M. That comic set the stage for Jean Grey's solo series, as well as a multitude of other X-Men comics. It marked the moment that Orchis, the vehemently anti-mutant organization that was introduced in House of X Powers of 10, made their boldest move to date. They'd been preparing for this, sabotaging Krakoa at every turn, using ugly but successful propaganda campaigns to turn humanity against mutants entirely. And at the Hellfire Gala, they succeeded. They didn't just launch a successful attack on Krakoa, they came extremely close to wiping out the entire mutant race. And one key to their victory involved Jean Grey. Orchis knew they had to take her off the board. Jean has proven throughout the Krakoa era that she is among the X-Men's biggest powerhouses. There can be no victory against mutants so long as she's alive. And that's where Moira McTaggart came in. She showed up at the gala with one purpose: to kill Jean. And for the most part, she succeeded. I say for the most part because killing Jean Grey is the Marvel equivalent of throwing pebbles into the ocean in hopes of stopping a hurricane. It's a losing battle at best, and it's playing with cosmic fire at worst. But even though Moira succeeded in killing Jean physically, Jean still managed to survive by holding her spirit together. And that's something that multiple psychics have done throughout the history of Marvel Comics. Jean Grey just happens to be better at it than most. But just saving her spirit and her essence isn't enough. Jean now has to find a way to fix this mess. She has to find a way to save her friends, her loved ones, and the entire mutant race. And this is where Jean Grey #1 picks up. However, the story that unfolds isn't just about her trying to come back to life. It starts with Jean in this strange mental space. She knows that she's dying. She herself acknowledges that this is nothing new for her. She also knows that her friends and loved ones are in danger. And she's determined to fix this. And note her choice of words there, because fixing things has certain implications. And those implications are a big part of how Jean's journey unfolds here. We see this beautiful spread of her major life events, from when her powers first manifest, to when she first joined the X-Men, to when she died, came back to life, and became Dark Phoenix. But the one moment she focuses on has to do with a more recent moment in her journey. It's the moment when she and the rest of the original 5 X-Men traveled to the future and stayed there for an extended period. This was the all-new X-Men era, which was started by Brian Michael Bendis. While that did go on for quite a while, and Jean definitely had some major moments during this time, she and the rest of the team did eventually go back to their own time, courtesy of Kid Cable. But after doing so, Jean made the fateful decision to erase their memories of their time in the future, and they would not remember their experience until a much later date. While that did keep the timeline intact, Jean now contemplates what could have happened had she not erased everyone's memories. She considers that maybe this was where everything went wrong. And if she had just changed this decision, then maybe that would fix things. That is an entirely understandable notion. Her erasing their memories of the future might have kept the timeline intact, but it robbed them of any opportunity to change certain events. Now they have all this knowledge and foresight, and they can use that to make things better. And since Jean was the one whose capabilities developed the most during their time in the future, she's in a better position to make those changes. Initially, some of those changes are quite bold. In the X-Men's first battle against Magneto, they don't let it escalate nearly as much as it did beforehand. Using their newfound skills, they're able to disarm Magneto with relative ease, and then Jean, knowing all the horrible things he'd do in the future, gives him a psychic lobotomy of sorts. He's not dead, but his mind was essentially blanked. It's the kind of attack that Jean never could have pulled off had her memories of the future been erased. And while that does neutralize Magneto, it greatly concerns Charles Xavier. It also sets a rather disturbing precedent for Jean. Because remember, Jean's telepathy did not manifest in conjunction with the rest of her powers. And that's largely because Charles Xavier put blocks on her mind at her own request to temper those powers. But now she has her telepathy and she's not holding back. And she's also using it in ways she never once dared. Yes, her intentions may be good, but that doesn't make the end results any less distressing. And it doesn't stop Jean and the rest of the original 5 X-Men from pursuing their mission. Professor Xavier may no longer support them, but they still continue their fight. So together, they put together this new base in the heart of New York City. And they're also a lot more open with the public than they were before, presenting the X-Men as heroes and trying to guide the narrative surrounding mutants, which was something Jean saw Orchis weaponize in the worst way possible. Now at first, their efforts seem successful, even as new threats like Boulevard Trask emerge. But then they face their first major setback. A young mutant's powers manifest in a crowded building, which causes a deadly explosion. But, rather than acknowledge the harsh truth, Jean warps everyone's mind to think it was a gas leak. And while that does rectify the situation temporarily, it ends up backfiring in a major way once the truth gets out. It actually results in Boulevard Trask being even more emboldened than he was in the original timeline. It's the first major incidence of the X-Men experiencing serious blowback by their efforts to change the timeline. And like it or not, Jean was at the heart of it, being the telepath who could actively change people's minds, and without their consent. Now, throughout the history of the X-Men comics, that sort of thing has been very taboo. And every time a powerful telepath does it, there are almost always huge consequences. But Jean, in her desire to fix things and her desire to change the timeline for the better, she thinks that she and the X-Men can manage those consequences. But things only start to compound even more. Because of Boulevard Trask, the X-Men aren't just targets. Every other mutant is, including those whose powers haven't manifested. So, with this in mind and with all their future knowledge in mind, Jean and the rest of the X-Men go about locating familiar mutants before their powers can manifest. That includes familiar faces like Kitty Pryde, Sam Guthrie, and Danielle Moonstar. But in their effort to protect them from future threats, Jean also ends up changing the memories of their friends and families. And in some cases, she makes their families completely forget they existed, something that really starts to concern Jean's teammates. It even gets to a point where Bobby and Warren leave the team, no longer comfortable with what she's doing. But it still keeps getting worse from there. Because just like the gas leak, the truth comes out. People are starting to notice that children are going missing and that mutants are a part of it. In terms of controlling the narrative, the X-Men have already failed. But Jean still tries to fix it. Even when Beast goes behind her back to share this news with Trish Tilby, Jean ends up attacking their minds as well. And remember, these are not strangers or enemies that she's manipulating. These are her closest friends and teammates. Even Cyclops, who supported her every step of the way, decides to walk away. And this is where Jean starts to get very unstable. This is where she starts to lament that she's becoming the monster she never wanted to become in the first place. And yet, Jean still thinks she can fix this. She just can't do it in a piecemeal fashion anymore. She needs more power. And this is where the Phoenix Force enters the picture. But this time around, she calls out to it long before the events of the original Phoenix Saga. But unlike the original Phoenix Saga, the power actually corrupts her much faster. It leads to this dramatic, heart-wrenching battle in which Professor Xavier leads the X-Men into a battle in hopes of stopping her. In the process, he flat out tells her that by trying to fix things, she just made everything worse. She gave humanity even more reasons to fear mutants. It results in an overdue but painful truth, and it doesn't really sink in until it's too late. In the end, the X-Men fail. And in the end, Jean fails too. She ultimately goes full Dark Phoenix and destroys everything and everyone around her. It marks a destructive but painful culmination. It also confirms for Jean that wiping their memories wasn't where everything went wrong. Changing that only changed everything for the worse. But she still believes there was a moment or a decision in which she could have fixed everything. And the next moment she's contemplating happens to be one of the most defining moments in the history of the X-Men. It's the moment when she first encountered the Phoenix Force while saving her friends from the crashing space shuttle. It's a hell of a teaser to end on. But ultimately, Jean Grey #1 succeeds in conveying one critical message. This notion of fixing everything by changing one fateful decision in the past, yes, it's tempting, but it's also fraught with complications and unintended consequences. Jean's heart is still in the right place, as it often is. She genuinely wants to fix things for the better. And given her immense abilities, even without the Phoenix Force, she is in a better position than most to do that. But by trying so hard and making things so much worse in the long run, it's downright traumatic for her. And it leads her to some very dark places. And if this issue is any indication, Jean isn't done exploring those dark places. It is also within those dark places that Jean's greatest strengths often emerge. Jean is at her best when she has to confront her own inner darkness as well as the darkness within others. Overall, Jean Grey #1 laid a great foundation for Jean's journey in this series. She is on a mission to fix things in the past in order to fix things in the present. But where will this lead her? What choices will she have to make? How painful will those choices be? And what sort of consequences will they incur? It promises to get plenty more dramatic, as well as fiery and destructive. But this being such a critical moment for Jean as well as the X-Men, I am very excited to see how things play out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.